There are a number of exclusions under the directive, and there's what's known as the permanent contract exclusion, and that's included in the bill. So that's an exclusion for agency workers who are employed by the employment agency under a permanent contract of employment are not affected by the pay elements of the bill. So what does that mean? Just to give you an example, if you're an employer and you say to your agency who's providing the agency workers, look, will you utilise that permanent contract provision? The agency workers must hire them and they must guarantee that if there is a gap in their employment between one end user and another, that they will continue to employ them during that gap. And if that is the case, then it is excluded under the legislation. Now, this will be interesting to see what way this pans out, because think about it like this. If you're a multinational company, or indeed any company, and you're in any area of the country, and you go to your agency and say, look, we want you to utilise this permanent contract exclusion. There's nothing really for the agency to say no to that. I mean, they could say, yeah, okay, we'll do that. Now, what happens if the employment, we'll say, of the agency worker comes to an end? Well, if the agency doesn't have a job for them, or they can't put them somewhere else, there might be a period of time which they would have to at least consider that, then ultimately the job is redundant. So it's not clear how that permanent contract exclusion will actually work in practice. So if you were an agency, you might be mindful to say, so we'll hire everybody and we'll give them a permanent contract and we utilise the permanent contract exclusion, because what's the worst thing that can happen? Worst thing that can happen is we can't find another job. We may have to pay them for a period of time and then turn around to them and say, well, unfortunately we can't, and therefore your job is redundant. So I think you still need to begin to look at this, and employers sort of, should still begin to look at, well, what should we begin to do from the 5th of December 2011? Should we still consider qualifying periods for sick pay, maternity pay, etc.? Because you never know what will actually happen between the bill and the act. And it may well be that they will be put into the broader definition. So I think it's still advisable, when you are looking at your broader terms and conditions such as sick pay and maternity pay and so forth, to at least consider widening those qualifying periods. So if you're hiring new employees, that they wouldn't become members of the sick pay scheme to at least 6 months or a year, or that you wouldn't get full maternity pay until after 6 months or a year. It's also important that you should review your contracts with the agencies, and indeed the agencies should review their contracts with employers, to seek indemnities and warranties in respect from the agency in respect of how such workers are retained by the agency. And this is a two-way street. So if you're saying, well, okay, there must be a sharing of information here, and employers must provide the agencies with up-to-date information. So the agency should be looking for an indemnity from the employer to say that that information is correct, and equally the agency, the employer should be looking at an indemnity from the agency in respect of how they will actually pay the basic pay and conditions once they provide them with the information. So those service level agreements between yourselves and your agencies probably do need to be looked at in detail. One of the other things on this is, well, what happens if there's a breach of this? Okay, and this is interesting as well, because in effect, given that the agency remains the employer of the person, if there's a breach of this act, then it's to their employer or to the agency that they go. They don't sue the end user, we put it like that, the hirer. And I think this is also going to give rise to some sort of, again, outside the box thinking, because if you think of it this way, if you're an employer and you provide the incorrect information, either by default or because you genuinely wanted just to mislead them, which I think is unlikely, the fact is that the employee then sues the agency. The agency then must sue you, the end user. So it's a kind of an oddity insofar as if you're an employer and you provide the incorrect information to the agency, then the employee sues the agency and the agency then sues you. Now, in reality, I can't see that the agencies, unless there's a complete breakdown in relationships, are going to turn around and begin suing the people that are providing them with work. So that's another interesting thing that I think we'll have to we see what way that pans out over time. So in general, on the Agency Workers Directive, it's not as bad as we had thought, and I still think there's things that can be done from an employer's perspective. And all told, I think the bill as it's currently written is I'm not saying to be welcomed, but it's certainly not as bad as I thought it would be.